Buenos dias, Piali, Kenwa, Hambio. Welcome everybody to another week. Hopefully you all are doing well. Uh, it's been pretty productive these last few weeks, and so I want to make sure that we keep on with that same energy. Um, so we just went over inditas and alabados here in New Mexico, and those are always really fun to learn about, especially with music. Like I'm a musician too, so it like always makes it more interesting for me whenever I get to talk about that and discuss the musical traditions here in New Mexico. Sorry, I'm getting like a little bit of a glare, my bad. Um, but one thing I want to talk about too is that um those are kind of quite a bit of the literary works that we get out of New Mexico um, pertain or connect with music. And so that's why it's a kind of an important part to discuss as well. And the other thing too is like it's very when you think of those different forms of literary works, like music and poetry kind of go hand in hand, especially if it has a lyrical content to it. And so that was the case with Inditas and Alabados, which is mostly lyrically driven and vocally driven because there wasn't a lot, like I told you guys before, um, there wasn't a lot with actually instruments. If anything, it'd be pretty simple, like I said, the drum and stuff like that too. What we're going to talk about today or this week is going to be a little different. And so it does add some other elements to it, but it still keeps with that's those same themes. And so that's one thing that I love about talking about corridos, and that's what we're talking about this week. The power of corridos and corridos place in New Mexico, right? And so in order to really grasp that, we kind of have to dive in and see what corridos are all about. Like what are they? What the heck is a corrido anyway? And so let's get into it. And so I like calling this the power of corridos. Um, I I love corridos. Like I can't think of a time period in my life where corridos weren't a part of it. And what I mean by that is not like, oh man, I've been playing corridos forever. No. Like I told most of you before, like I was more of like a heavy metal and hip hop uh uh head, if you will, or person, right? And so but corridos were always like a part of my upbringing in regard to like family. And so one thing that's always interesting about corridos is that for me anyways was that it didn't matter what kind of event we were having or like congregation if you will with my familia. My tios would always bring their instruments, and so there was always going to be a jam session. And so I remember this from when I was little, which is doesn't say that much because I'm pretty short. So when I was like like a little kid, like maybe even like a toddler, I can remember them playing for the holidays or for even just like birthdays and stuff like that too. And so that was something that was always like really cool for me because I was always like around it. And I remember the stories that were told. And that's one thing that's really cool about corridos is they're attached to these this storytelling. And I'll go into that further in a minute. But one thing that always made me drawn to it was um that fact that it was like storytelling. It was like those times when we get to hear about these people, about this event, about this situation even, right? And so I always was drawn to it and I still am. I still listen to corridos today, and I'll talk more about some of those things too because there's like modern versions of it, right? Um but this is those this is the one that kind of gets me even more like in my heart, I guess, like in my corazon, right? And that's because um this was like a genre that kind of has really deep meaning to me because of my family and like one situation in particular too. Um when I was in middle school, I got involved with the wrong crowd, if you will. Um, and I got involved with gangs and all that stuff. Um, and things got pretty wild for me, right? And so and this was like I was probably like 12, and it wasn't like my family's problems. It's just people I started hanging out with and I fell into it. The communities I was in engaged with too were also heavily influenced by things like that. And so I got involved in it, witnessed some pretty bad stuff, was in a car that robbed a place. I didn't rob the place, but the people I was with did. Um, and then even being around people that were pretty wild. And so I had like a fork in the road, and that fork in the road was kind of interesting because I was walking home with one of my friends who lived across the street from me, who was also in the same gang as me. And we when we were walking home, another group of gang members rolled up on us that were from another gang, right? Rival gang. And there was like 10 of them and two and just us two, right? And so they were gonna jump us. They were gonna beat us up, right? And my homie who I was with, Snoops, he was beefing with this guy named Parrot, right? And Parrot got in Snoop's face, and everybody kind of surrounded us, right? And then my homie Snoops reaches back in back of his pants and pulls out a gun and points it right to Parrot, who the guy he was beefing with head, like right here, like right between the eyes. And my immediate response was just to run. So I ran, and I looked back, and like I wasn't the only one that ran. Like a lot of those other dudes booked too. They took off. As a matter of fact, one of them ran past me. That's how fast he was running. Um, and I ran home and went and hid in the closet for like 2 hours. Because I thought they were gonna come to a drive-by because they knew where we lived and stuff like that. Meanwhile, the phone was ringing like crazy, and it was my homie Snoops. And he was like, "Why'd you leave? What are you, a wuss or what?" And all this stuff, right? And then I was just like, "I can't do this anymore, bro. It's you guys are getting too low." And so he's like, "You want out?" And I was like, "Yes." And so they it's kind of funny to say, but they like organized a session, if you will, to like rank me out of the gang. And so they took me. I was over here by the railroad tracks in Albuquerque. They met me there, and they beat the shit out of me. I had to go to the hospital for a few days. I broke a couple of ribs, um, punctured my lung, um, and it was a pretty bad situation. And I was in the hospital, and luckily I was fine. I was okay enough to like get better and healthy and all this stuff, right? And everything healed up okay. And I just had like a little tear, and but I still had to like be in the hospital, right? And so my family was very disappointed in me, obviously, and stuff like that. And I was honest with them and stuff. And but then what happened is I was like kind of taking a turn for the worse because I got like depressed, kind of, I guess you would say, like in the hospital, because of how I felt like I failed my family, right? And one of the things that happened that was like, and this is where this all ties in, is one day I'm sitting there and like I don't know if you guys know, but like whenever something like that happens to you, you have to like they give you this little thing and it's like a plastic tube and you blow into it and it has a little ball and it moves up and you have to do that to like get your lungs stronger so you can go home, right? And so they told me you need to do this and you need to blow to this until you can do that. You're not going to be able to go home. That was just kind of giving it, honestly. Um, and then one day my Theo walks in and he walks in and he has this guitar case with him. And I'm like, oh no, what does this dude want? And so he comes in and he starts talking to me and he's like, oh, mijo, I'm sorry you're in here and all this stuff. And, you know, you did the right thing, even though this is what happened to you and that kind of thing and all this stuff. And he was a man of very little words. So it was kind of interesting to hear that from him. Uh, but then what happened is he's like, you want to, is it okay if I play? And I was like, yeah, sure. And then so he took his guitar out, and this man was like, all he played was really corridos. That's like, and like other like traditional, like Mexican songs. You know what I mean? Like folk music. And so he starts playing, and he plays a couple of songs, and they're all corridos, right? And he's like, "Okay, mijo, now you're gonna play with me." And I was like, "I don't have a guitar and stuff." And he's like, "Here," and he gave me a harmonica. My abuelita plays the harmonica, or my nanita, she plays the harmonica. And so I had already kind of messed around with it because of her, you know. And so I was like, I don't know, Theo, I'm not, I don't really feel good. And he's like, come on, mijo, let's play. And then, so he kind of talks me into it. So he starts playing, and then I start playing too with him, right? And I'm like, oh, barely being able to blow it. And we go through, we play for a little while, and then I get kind of tired. He's like, okay, um, well, it was fun being with you and all this stuff, and I hope you keep getting better, mijo. And I was like, thanks, Theo. And then he said, I'll see you tomorrow. And I was like, what? You know, and this is a guy that like I would see him frequently, but not all the time. And the next day he comes, same thing. We jam. Next day he comes, same thing. We jam. Finally, I'm able to kind of like blow that ball up to where I can get out. They let me out to go home myself to continue to do stuff like that. Every day he goes to my house um to jam with me. And we played corridos. We played like Gabino Barrera, of course, and other old corridos and stuff that he wrote and all this stuff. And then I got better. And so after that, um, I continued to be close to my Theo and stuff like that. He passed away like around 10 years ago. And but he really gave me an opportunity to like put my life into perspective after I already had that kind of fork in the road. And so I started playing music more. Um, not corridos. Like I started doing more music. I started playing guitar and doing other stuff too, bass and all this stuff. And then I would like play whenever my tios would play and all this stuff and join them. And it like literally like straight up like I know it sounds kind of like a cliche, but it literally saved my life. Um, this music, right? And so whenever I think of corridos, I'll automatically think of that. And it was a really special moment in my life, and even got me to where I even say like this that like moment really got me to where even I am today, right? And so I'm always indebted to my Theo, uh and corridos always have a special place in my heart because of that. And so that's why the power of the corrido is so important, and so significant, right? So like sorry to go deep with this, but I wanted to let you guys know for real like where my appreciation of this comes from. um and it's special to me, you know. And I loved being able to like when I got to the point where I understood about research, to research about it and talk to other people who are embedded in this kind of work too, to come up with something awesome. And so I want to talk to you guys this week about this, about the corridos, right? And so first off, we have to understand what a corrido was or is, sorry. And so let's talk about them real quick. So a corrido is basically a popular narrative based song. Um, and even in poetic form, right? And so, and the other thing too is like mostly they're like ballads, and usually they're written in like a waltz rhythm. So it's like doom 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 doom, right? Like we hear that all the time, like in a lot of New Mexican music, especially, and Mexican music. And so the songs have specific themes too. So sometimes it's about um obviously sometimes like about love and loss of love, but other times it's about oppression, about history, about the daily life of peoples themselves, and even other topics that maybe wouldn't be typically discussed in other songs. And so corridos end up being that. They're a song and a song format or a genre, if you will, of the people. Like it's straight up created about and usually listened to by the people. And so although we understand that corridos are really old, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes, but we also have to understand that like it's still a thing. Like we still hear corridos today, but they mostly became popular during what we know as the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s, right? And so but before that they existed. Like don't get me wrong, like I'm not, I hate when people like 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 think that something starts just then. No, that's when they became more popular and more widespread. And a lot of it had to do with other things too, which I'll talk about in a few minutes too. But ideally, they wanted to spread this style, right, or this genre, because it did that. It told stories. It explained things to people, right? And so that's one thing that was really cool about corridos. The other thing too about corridos that's awesome is that they are perfect examples of oral tradition. So some of these corridos um, go back even further than 200 years. And so, especially in northern Mexico and then southwestern United States, which includes us, right? It includes New Mexico. And so we have a bunch of great corridos here that are those perfect examples of storytelling and stuff. Um, but really, um, corridos are just about that. They tell stories about people. They tell stories about people taking on the establishment. They tell stories about these great leaders or notorious people, right? These victories, all this different stuff. And at one point, like it was kind of the news for people. And so like the singers or the people, the musicians, the musicals who would play these um would hear about something going on, right? Maybe somewhere else, in a town next to them or city next to them, whatever, right? And they'd come back and after writing this song, right? And then they would play it to let people know what's going on. So they were like the news report. And this is pre newspaper for a lot of places, right? Like not a lot of people had access to that. So the musico would go out there and play these songs and tell people what was going on. And so it was like very tied to some other traditions that influence corridos and other genres of music too. But for real, this is probably like one of the oldest forms of like um letting people know what the news was and letting people know about the histories and stuff like that um in this kind of form. And in order to understand that too, you have to understand that there are these other traditions that influence this kind of stuff, right? And so one of them is troubadouric traditions. And so troubadours, you guys hopefully have heard of troubadours. And so troubadours were these musicians from different places around the world. Mostly they came from places in like the Mediterranean and stuff like that. And then they made their way out to other areas in Europe and even in Eastern Europe. But most notably, we get them in medieval Spain. Um, and so during that time, uh, these musicians would go around and they'd play songs, and these songs were usually some of them were love songs and stuff like that too, but a lot of times they were songs being critical of the kings and rulers of their areas, and they would also tell stories of grandeur about like battles and like knights and all this kind of crazy stuff, right? And so when we see them in the TV, it's always like the guy with the lute, and he's like on this day, and like they tell this story, and that's where we get those traditions. So troubadouric um, culture, if you will, ends up influencing multiple genres of music. One of them being corridos, right? And so when we hear corridos and we listen to the stories, we can't help but make that connection to troubadours. And so really the musicos who end up being the ones that are singing the corridos here in the Southwest and in Mexico and other places are essentially troubadours of that time. And so what they did is they did the same thing. And troubadours, like back in the day, like during this time, like we have these photos, these paintings and stuff here, like it was frowned upon. Like it wasn't, it was like pretty wild for you to be a troubadour because there was a lot that could happen to you as a troubadour. So people would, a lot of them would get chased out of towns and villages and stuff like that because they would kind of speak the truth and tell these stories and they wouldn't hold stuff back. And so people would be offended. They would write songs about the queen or the princess that were kind of vulgar and stuff like that too. And so like they would be chased and beat down and like run out of places, even killed some of them because of what they sang about. But that didn't stop them. They continued to do that, right? So it was like they were like very rebellious and they were like kind of like the rock stars, if you will, of their time, right? And so troubadours did that. That's what they did. And so when Europeans came to well, you know what they call the New World, right? The Americas and the Caribbean, some of the people they brought with them were musicos too. So some of these people were troubadours. They came over, and some of them were brought over because they were forced because they did bad stuff over there. Like, well, they're saying about bad stuff over there, and so they're like, "Nah, you're gonna go over there now." So now you're a soldier, a conquistador, or whatever, right? And so they bring them over here. Well, they bring those traditions with them, right? And so this is like a guitar too. I wanted to mention some of these photos too. So this is a guitar from back then. They were smaller, um, but they kind of did the same thing. We saw lutes and stuff like that make their way over here, but by this point, guitars were like the instrument. So when they come over, they bring some of those tunes with them, but they bring the traditions. And so people here end up really connecting with that. Why? Well, that's easy because one of the things that was important about um, troubadours and their traditions was they were very similar to the traditions that we saw here already, right? So one thing I think is lovely about corridos too, and this kind of ties into what I'm talking about now, is that idea of mestizaje that happened or mestizoism, right? And so one thing that's kind of cool about corridos is it doesn't look at the world through like the traditional lens. It really looks at it through the mestizo or mestizaje, a lens of mestizaje. Um, and so we don't see things the same way. So corridos end up really encompassing that folkloric storytelling perspective too, or traditions, right? And so these oral traditions, like storytelling and things like that, end up being a big part of what they do. And the thing that's really cool about it is it's like culturally sustaining both of those things too. And a lot of it is cool because it is unique, like I said here, to the borderland, right? It truly is a good example of that. Why? Like when you and I've talked about this so many times with our examples here in New Mexico, is that idea of mestizaje is like totally embedded within our culture, even to the point where we don't even like realize it. Like other outsiders will be like, you guys do this weird, like what's up with that, right? Or like, well, why do you guys do this? Because that truly is what it is. It's the idea of mestizaje too, right? So one thing that's really cool about it is it does pay homage to indigeneity and troubadouric tradition in this oral tradition based music, right? So to us, this is literature, even though some people won't consider it that, but we do. So once again, like I said, going back to those oral traditions and oral histories. And so we understand this and we even like use it as like a tool, right? To where we utilize corridos even in like the telling of an event, right? That a real historic event. We'll use that in there. We'll link that in there. Why? Because that's a part of it, right? That's to us a very significant example of the story, right? Of the history. So it's kind of a cool thing, just like we see with traditions in the Southwest with indigenous people, right? So let's go into corridos of the Mexican Revolution. Oh, I forgot to mention this too before I forget. So some of the first corridos we had date back to the early 1800s. And the way we found them is by people notating on in like journals and stuff like that too, or chronicles, corridos they had written, right? So these musicos would write it down, and they even put the notations of the chords, the acordes, that what they were using when they were playing, right? And so the first one we have is from 1808. Pretty cool that we have that far back. Like there wasn't a lot of that going on in different places, especially around the Southwest, but we have those examples of it, which are really special. And so corridos continue to be utilized for a long time. And researchers like Vicente Mendoza, who did a very amazing did amazing research into corridos, um, ends up splitting up into basically three different periods. And the periods end up ascending from the early 1800s all the way until like 1910, where we see them end up being like at their height, right? Where it just like after 1910, it's just like boom, it blows up. Okay. And so during that period, it ends up being from like the 1910s to the 1930s, and this is the era of like the Mexican Revolution. But then after that, they kind of decline a little bit in the next period, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of diasporas that are happening during that time, and so people moving around and stuff like that too. But in the end, it really is that it's not a bad thing. It ends up being a really good thing because we get corridos all over the place, right? And so those time periods end up being very important because they end up providing us with a lot of context as to what corridos meant to people and then how they spread throughout different regions, right? And so that's always an awesome thing. But the corridos of the Mexican Revolution are when it really takes off. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that people were utilizing corridos as a news source. And so, like I told you before, there wasn't like not everybody had radios and TVs like we have today, right? And so the corridos end up being what's gonna be so significant to the cultures, right? And so it's pretty cool that they're able to get that out there. And a big part of it was because during the Mexican Revolution, and after, they really wanted to emphasize Mexico's place in the world, right? And so what they did was they started a lot of cultural production, which was focused primarily on Mexican culture. And so what they did is they started producing all this stuff, anything from music to art to even films whenever they start getting into the film industry. And that's one thing that kind of picks up a lot too is was things like that, those art forms, dance, all that stuff, right? And so that's where we start getting these really famous artists to come out of Mexico and places like that, right? And so because of cultural production, and like I said, they wanted to like establish like national um examples of national identity. And so part of that was like through music and through other art forms, right? And so that's where we end up like people will like associate certain things with Mexico, and it was like it even ends up leading to like stereotypes, like honestly. And so like when you go to another country, you're like, what's Mexican music? People are like mariachi, right? What is a Mexican person look? They have a big sombrero and shit, right? Well, why? Because like that was what was laid out by the Mexican government to like what the look would be. And so that comes out of there. A couple of the genres were mariachi and corridos. That's what they went with. Mariachi ends up implementing corridos into the genre, but making it mariachi style, right? So we see that being played out too. I like these photographs here because they have songs like this is like what it probably looked like during the Mexican Revolution, where it's like there's these dudes playing instruments, and then there's these dudes with guns and pistolas and stuff, right? To that are fighting. And so these guys may have watched a battle, wrote a tune about it, and then went to the next town and told them about it. The Arelitas too, or the female soldiers who fought in the Mexican Revolution too. Like I love how like she's like holding the gun and stuff like that. And this is like a painting, of course, right? But then the like the singers in the back of her like, and I think he's like telling everyone a tune, singing everyone a tune about um the Arelitas too. And then we also have like this stuff too where we see the musicians playing. And it's funny too, because like they always portray them like with bullets on them and stuff too, because a lot of times they were the soldiers too. So that was another thing. So they may have been in the battle, then wrote a tune about it, went next place, and they're like, "You sing a song about it, right? Sing this corrido about it." And so I put a link on the module too for corridos of the Mexican Revolution. So it's a YouTube playlist where you can hear some of these. It's great. So check it out. So now we're moving a little bit north to where we are, right? Corridos of New Mexico. And so one thing about here is that we saw a lot of those same things occur. So we saw a lot of songs or corridos written about the people here in New Mexico, about the experience here in New Mexico. And it was made by us, right? So we had corridos that we played that came up north from Mexico, right? And we have to remember too, the border passed us, right? So the political border passed us. You know, we didn't cross it, right? The border crossed us. Um, and so those tunes were a lot already over, were already over here. But one thing that was kind of cool too was the fact that we were able to create our own that are totally connected just to our community, right? And so there's a lot of cool stuff in regard to that. This is a cool one here photo of people here in Nuevo Mexico playing corridos, right? Playing songs. And there's a bunch of different examples too. One of them you're gonna read this week too is one of those examples from New Mexico tradition, corrido tradition, right? And then there's also other things like this is a great little reader. This is where that corrido you're going to be reading this week is from. It's called Corridos Sin Fronteras, and it was actually from like a movie they made, like a documentary kind of, and it kind of talks about that, right, and shares that history. This one they have corridos about miners, like people that were miners here in New Mexico. Like you guys heard of the film Salt of the Earth that was banned because it was during the Red Scare with McCarthyism, where it was considered like communistic uh um rhetoric, right, and stuff like that. So they banned that film, Salt of the Earth, which takes place in New Mexico with New Mexicans or Mexicans, they call them too, who are fighting because they don't have they don't have good rights and good treatment in the mine they're working at, right? And it takes place here, right? And so there was examples of that in our corridos too, where it's like about that kind of stuff. It's about addressing those issues. It's about unionizing. It's like all this cool stuff. And uh it's pretty cool because other scholars here in New Mexico end up understanding that and like doing more research about it. And it also being embedded in the craft too makes a big difference. And so this is Cipriano Vigil, who you're gonna read our reading from this week, and he's our dude in regard to that. So he's our scholar and our practitioner, if you will, right? He is a musician and a researcher, and he has done all this stuff to collect this information. I showed you before. He's the dude that played the entrega. Um, he's our dude. Like I said, like that's the guy that knows the most about New Mexican music, and in this case, corridos too, right? And he has great knowledge. One of the videos too that I shared up there was is a video where he performs some music too, from New Mexico, um, with this same traditions, right? And so it's pretty cool. He's a multi-instrumentalist too, so he can play a lot of different stuff. I love this picture too because he's playing like some like handmade like violin or fiddle or whatever, right? And like he just does that kind of stuff too. So he also is an instrument maker, which is also another amazing thing. But that those traditions of corridos end up being like very, very much a part of our culture here in New Mexico. So we have a bunch of different variations of it. One of my favorite ones was my homie Keith Sanchez, who is a musician too, a modern day troubadour here in Albuquerque in New Mexico. He was in a band called Strike Frame, another heavy metal band, but now he plays more like blues and Latin rock and stuff like that too. More, um, and he still plays a bunch of corridos. But he told us this cool, too cool corrido his tío wrote. That his tío went fishing, right? And he caught this big trout, giant silver trout. Reels the trout in, and it's huge, right? Uh, and when he reels it in, it comes onto the shore, right? And it turns into a woman, and she has silver skin. And they're like shocked, him and his brother, right? Are shocked because there's this trout that turned into a woman, right? And their response to her was like, "Who are you?" And then she goes like that and hisses at him and then jumps back in the water and turns back into a trout. And so his tío wrote a corrido about that. And he was dead serious that happened too. Like he said it wasn't a lie, like that really happened. And so even like things like that, like kind of like almost humorous stuff too, end up being a part of corridos. And then even here it's very similar. Okay, like I mean, like not very similar because that's from here. We have very similar examples of that with other people too, writing. Corridos and troubadours, like in a modern sense too. So we still have all that stuff. So we have these old stories about like um Gregorio Cortez and how he fought all these people and he just was just him and his pistola, right? And then we have like the musicals who play like at events we're at, our tios, our grandparents, our grandfathers, our neighbors, right? Or the dude at the restaurant we're eating at, or these people still play this stuff. And then we even have more modern ones like corridos tubados, um, and corridos narcos and stuff like that too, where we have it in a more modern context, and even like influenced by things like hip hop and stuff like that too, where we have this wide range of corridos, which is wild to me. There's some examples here too about the lyrical contents because the language also follows certain elements too, in regard to corrido stylings. And so what ends up happening is they end up being these stories told in poetic form, and sung very simply with basic music and much like we saw with the troubadouric uh, ballads that we heard before too. But they use that common language and everyday language and vernacular too, right? And so it's not too hard for people to connect with. And that's what's beautiful about it too, is you're not going to have songs that are like that. They're going to be like words that people use every day, right? And most of them, like most of the time, we hear them just in Spanish. Although there are corridos that we do hear in English and stuff like that too, but most of the time we're going to hear them in Spanish language, right? Um, but it's not as common. Um, so we also see a mix with two languages where it's like Spanglish, right? Like there's actually a lot like that nowadays, which is kind of cool. So it's kind of neat because it addresses the audience too, right? So they work to do that. And they always have a very like sincere tone, but it can also be satirical, right? And like humorous. But let's talk about the structure too. So they can tell stories that are fictional or nonfiction or historical stories too. Um, Once again, in the vernacular, the language of the people that are meant to hear them, right? Um, and so they have this varied poetic form, uh, and they always follow kind of the same structure, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I wanted to kind of talk about this too. So this is like And they always have this tinge too, and like especially here or in the Southwest in Mexico, like we're connected to what we see um in the borderlands, right? And so this is Los Alegres de Terran, and this is from like 1938 or 40 or something like that. This is an old tune, and you hear about what they're talking about, and it's like when people say now like all corridos narcos and all this stuff are like it's like new stuff. No, look at this. So I'll read it in English. Okay, so they crossed the Rio Grande just about sunset with plenty of white cargo that they had to sell. They arrived in San Antonio without any trouble, and they went straight away to the Navidad Street. So corridos narcos, a lot older than we when we think of corridos now. So pretty cool stuff there. There's other examples too. I love Chalino Sanchez. He had some really dope corridos. If you don't know about him, go learn. I'm not playing them on here because then my video won't be able to be played by you guys because of the copyright stuff. And so I put the links and stuff like that in the module too, I think. Um, we'll go listen to such Chalino Sanchez. Alma's my one of my favorite songs from him. Um, he was wild, man. He his sister got killed by somebody that was part of the Mexican mafia. And so he retaliated and killed him, I guess. And like he had to escape Mexico, so he moved up here to the US, California, and was like as a teenager, and then started doing stuff. He wrote songs all the time, mostly corridos. And so someone he met ended up uh, reading some of his stuff, and they wanted to record him. So they had this artist start recording him, and so his tunes were being recorded and stuff like that. But one day, one of the artists didn't show up to record, and so they were like, "Yo, do you sing?" And he's like, "I can sing." And so they threw him on the mic, right? And he just spit fire. And so they were like, yes. So they started recording all these albums, and he like that first day he dropped like 5 songs or something like that, recorded them. And next thing you know, he blew up as an artist. But Chalino's dope. He died too because he actually went back and played in Mexico during the middle of his set. Somebody handed him a note and he was reading it, and they basically told him, "We're gonna kill you after the show." And instead of running away, that fool performed his best show he ever had, and then they killed him. Pretty wild stuff. But great tunes too. One thing about corridos too that's always awesome too is uh they end up being also uh um sung by women too. So we had a lot of corridos that were written by women as well. And so but it won't be till like that turn of the century, like we said before. And I mean there were women before that sang songs and stuff like that too with corridos, but it was kind of male dominated for a while, and then it ended up being easier. But now like corridos are wild because like you get to see some that are like pretty provocative too. So like Jenny Rivera, who I love too, she's awesome, man. Like if you haven't heard her before, great tunes too. Um, and kind of the same thing where we see provocative stuff. We're even singing about nautical stuff and even like other things too that are pretty cool that you didn't really see too much in traditional uh Chicana or Latina artists. More modern context, we have people like Nathaniel Cano, who is a does corridos tumbados, but the thing I love about this is we get to see in a more modern context. This song came out like 2 years ago, I think, or a couple years ago. Um, where we see the outstretch of corridos. And so this is Tokisha is the girl in the album cover there. And she's Dominican Republic. She's from Dominican Republic. She's Dominicana. And she loves corridos and she wanted to do a corrido song. And that's typically not her style at all. Like she does more like kind of like hip hop um or like trap and but in Spanish, right? And so she wanted to do a corrido. She hit up Nathaniel and they came up with this tune called Kilos de Amor. Great song. It has that like narcos tinge to it too, still and stuff, but just dope. I love this thing, and it still has that hip hop influence kind of too, but it's still very traditional corrido style, which is great. Now, last, I want to talk about like how corridos influence country music too. because a lot of times people think country is like its own thing, but really it's not. Like country is very influenced by the genres of Mexican folk music and specifically things like corridos too. And so artists like Willie Nelson, who is from Texas, right? Um, Dwight Yoakam, who's from Bakersfield, California, which is predominantly populated with Mexicanos, right? And so, and then people like Johnny Cash, um, very influenced too by corridos, and a lot of people don't know that. But you listen to their tunes and you can hear it in them, right? Like you can hear that influence in those songs. People like George Strait too. You can hear those influences in those songs. Like Willie Nelson's talked about it before about how much Mexican music was influential to him, right? Same thing with both these other artists. I don't know if you guys remember, if you guys watch Walk the Line, the biopic about um Johnny Cash. Well, whenever he's gonna record the songs and they're like, um, the guy that's recording him is like, oh, I don't know, man, like this sounds just like everything else. And he's like, well, I have some songs I wrote in the Air Force. Do you have anything against the Air Force? And he's like, no. And he's like, I do, right? So like uh he was stationed in Texas. And while there, he ended up hearing a lot of the music that was there too, right? And that also influenced him, and you can hear it in his tunes, right? And his attitude, right? Like there he is flipping the bird, right? And I love that about Johnny, and a lot of people love Johnny Cash because of that. But it was also his tunes too. Like you think about like his songs, like his lyrical content of his songs, and even the structure of it, right? And so he has that there. When you hear like um some of his songs, you see that all the time. So when you hear like Folsom Prison Blues, it's like, I hear that train a coming, it's coming round the bend, and I ain't seen the sunshine since I don't know when. I'm stuck in Folsom Prison, right? So it's this story, right? And like a lot of songs tell stories, but this is different. It's very much structured like a corrido. Although it may not have all the structure, it has that influence. So I want to talk to you guys real quick. Oops, I went too far. So real quick about your assignment, you're gonna have to write a corrido this week too. And so you'll break it down on the assignment. It has a broken down to how you can do the rhyme scheme. So it's like A B C B D B in a 6 line, or you could do 4 line with A B C B, right? And you'll see the stanzas and how it works and all that stuff on there. If you have questions, hit me up and I'll really help you. Don't stress out all crazy about it. It's not that I don't want you to like freak out and stuff like that. You don't have to write a whole one. You're just writing a verse and a chorus basically. All right. And so you're gonna do that. You also have your midterms due. So you need to go to an outside event. It can be a number of things. It could be um a poetry reading, it could be a gallery exhibit, anything like that. It don't have to be those of you guys that are out of state or not close to here. It doesn't have to be on New Mexico. It could be something in your community too. Like I said, this is New Mexico Literary Landscapes and beyond, right? But if you could find something that was like tied to some of the stuff that we're talking about, wonderful. All right. But the thing is to get you out there and to enjoy some of these pieces of these examples of art, right? And to especially literary stuff if you can. But to me, like I can do literary interpretations of any kind of piece of art. Cool. Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. I hope you guys have a great spring break. And we'll see you all when you get back. Bueno, bye.